English literature short introductions. First, we will look at literature before Chaucer. Well, English literature, the history of English literature is not that old, maybe 1,500 years or so, compared to Indian literature or Chinese literature or literature of the Middle East. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written just thousands of years back, and Greco-Roman literature, which is also pretty ancient. Compared to many classical literatures, English literature is relatively young, hardly a millennium and a half. So we will look at the Old English period today, and I have given a title here, England before the English. Before we come to Old English, before we come to English at all, we need to look at who were the people in England before the English people actually came. The earliest inhabitants of the British Islands, you can see the island here, the picture here, were prehistoric people about whom we have evidence, but we do not know much definite about them. But we know that for quite some years, maybe a couple of 1,000 years before AD began, a group of people called the Celts, who called themselves Britons, lived in the major parts of the British Islands. There were many Celtic tribes, and you can see them depicted in this map here. There are names of various tribes which inhabited different parts of England. We have some evidence of the Celtic writing, Celtic culture, etc., from archaeological evidences, but we do not know a lot about them. We must remember that Celtic is a language which is very related to Germanic, Italian, Greek, etc., which are all part of the Indo-European family of languages. So the Celts, or the Celtic people, occupied the British Islands for a long time. And then in early AD, in maybe the 1st century or a little before that, during the time of Julius Caesar, there were attempts to annex these islands and make it part of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar himself landed in England. You can see here Gaul in this bottom corner. Gaul is the old name for France, and you can see how close England is to France, and the little bit of ocean here is called the English Channel, and the big bit of ocean here is called the North Seas, and the western part is basically Atlantic Ocean, and all these are, the sea is basically part of the Atlantic Ocean. So Julius Caesar crossed over to England from Gaul, and his ambition was to conquer the island, but that did not work out. He faced very stiff resistance from the Celts, and he had to go back. But later on, maybe a century or so after Caesar, England was systematically conquered by the Romans, the emperors who followed Julius Caesar. And there was a period when much of England, you can see here, except the green on the top, which is named Caledonia, which is the old name for Scotland, and this island is named Hibernia, which is the old name for Ireland. Much of the major parts of England were occupied by the Romans. Now, the Celts were ruled over by Romans for quite a long period of time. So from the 1st century approximately to the 5th century AD, Romans were here in England. They were the rulers of England. They did not bring their families and settle down, but they were the rulers. So they built constructions that would enable them to administer the land properly. So even today we can see roads that the Romans built at that time. And here you can see the Hadrian wall. Hadrian was an emperor of Rome at that time, and he built a wall here to prevent hostile Celts who were living in the Caledonian region. They were also Celts. Britons were the people who lived in the lower part, and these parts, Caledonia, had many Celtic tribes. They are called Gaelic tribes, and including Picts, Scots, etc. And they were very hostile people. And the terrain here also was very hostile. It was very mountainous, and the Romans found it very difficult to access these regions or subjugate the people there, and so they built a wall across this region. It's called Hadrian's Wall, remnants of which you can still see there. And this is the Roman Empire, part of the Roman Empire, Roman Britain. They ruled for a few centuries, and gradually the Celts were reduced to the status of subjects. They lost their warlike quality to a large extent, and they became very tame people who worked for the Romans. So still we don't have any English people living in England. We must remember that. And who were the English people? The English people, the original English people, lived in mainland Europe. You can see the arrows here. The blue arrow shows the origin of the tribe of people called the Jutes. The red arrow denotes the place from where the tribe of people called the Saxons came, and the yellow arrow shows the place from which the tribe of people called the Angles came. And who were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes? They belonged to a large group of a tribe called a large family called the Germanic family. And the Germanic family had many languages that later evolved from it. German is a Germanic language, so is English. So we must remember that the Celtic people and the Germanic people were related, and they were originally one group of people, maybe a few thousands before. But at the time we speak of them, they had little similarity in terms of the language they were speaking. So this is an example also for the way in which languages diverge. When people, communities diverge and form groups, they form different languages which, initially they will be similar, but if there is no communication between them, these languages evolve to be fully independent languages. Anyway, here we have a kindred group of people. They were similar to each other, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They spoke different varieties of one language. We call that language West Saxon, West Germanic, not West Saxon, West Germanic. And they all spoke, they probably understood each other, though their languages were a bit different from one another. So after the Romans had left England, the Celts were very vulnerable, and they were attacked by the Picts and the Scots from the north. Here, Picts and the Scots started attacking England once the Romans left. And from about 450 AD onwards, after the Romans had completely withdrawn, England also was occupied, systematically attacked and occupied by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, who were Germanic people. Originally, they were invited to the English island by the Celts so that they could resist the Picts and the Scots, but soon these invited people became residents, so they began a systematic occupation of England. That is how the English people came to England. The word English came from Angles, so the land of the Angles became England. Though the name Britain came from the original inhabitants who were the Celts, the name England and English came from the Angles, who were very closely related to the Saxons and the Jutes, who also came and occupied various parts of the British island. Okay. And these three groups of people ultimately blended together, and they came to be called English. And we call them the Anglo-Saxons. We call them Old English also. Looking back from modern times, that is how we call them. And here you can see Northumbria. Northumbria, there's a river in this region called the river Humber, and the region north of river Humber is Northumbria. So largely the Angles settled in the Northumbrian region, and you have Wessex here, and where the Saxons, the Jutes settled in the Kent region, which would be somewhere here, and the Saxons occupied Wessex, Essex, etc. Those are matters we're not going to go into very great detail, because our focus is on literature of the period. That is the arrival of the English into the British island. So we must remember the British islands were originally inhabited by the Celts, as far as we know, maybe 2000 years ago, and then the Romans came, and the Romans occupied and ruled for a few centuries, and the Romans left, and then the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, which are Germanic tribes, came and occupied England, and they totally became the inhabitants of England. And what happened to the Celts? The Celts were driven to the hostile terrains, marked in green here, to the Scottish part. There already a kind of Celtic tribes were living there, Picts and Scots. So the poor Celts who lived in the main part of England, who were pushed out, probably moved to this green part here, which is Wales, and to Ireland, which is here, and to this end here. And even today we find the Celtic people, or people of Celtic descent, living in Scotland, in Cornwall, in Wales, in Ireland, etc. And the main part of England, you marked in a kind of yellowish color, orange color here, was occupied by the English tribes, and they developed into 7 kingdoms, and they became very powerful. And from around 5th century to around the 11th century, they dominated the land and they flourished. And that is the beginning of English, the story of English. And these people are called the Anglo-Saxons, or the Old English people. And once they had settled in England, what happened was Christianity arrived. Around 6th century, at the end of 6th century, in 597, Augustine of Canterbury, today we call him Saint Augustine of Canterbury, he came from Rome, sent by Pope Gregory to Christianize England. Well, England was Christianized from the northern part as well, but that's another story. But here we are talking about the arrival of Christianity into mainland England, and it was brought by Augustine of Canterbury. And he was welcomed by King Ethelbert of Kent. He landed in the region around Dover and moved to Canterbury. And there he was welcomed by King Ethelbert of Kent. He already had a Christian wife. Her name is Bertha, and the land was very friendly towards Christianity at that time. And Augustine built a huge abbey in Canterbury. You can see the ruins of the abbey in the front part of this picture here. They are in ruins today. It was destroyed during the reign of Henry VIII, later in the 16th century. The ruins are still there in England, in Canterbury. And behind that we can see the Canterbury Cathedral, which came later. Anyway, we should remember that Canterbury Cathedral is of importance to English history and English literature in many ways. And Augustine of Canterbury became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. In modern days too, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of English Church, but he doesn't actually live in Canterbury anymore. The office of the Archbishop of Canterbury today is in London. But the Canterbury Cathedral is still functional, and thousands of people still visit the Canterbury Cathedral as tourists, and services too go on there. It's an active cathedral today. But the monastery that Augustine established was later destroyed. Anyway, I'm telling you all this because to introduce Christianity in New England. Christianity brought monks who were educated. Christianity brought in Latin language into England. England already had an exposure to Roman language when the Romans occupied, but at that time the English people were not there. They were in the continent, and now the Romans have left and the English people have established themselves in England, and they are exposed to the Roman culture once again through the church. So Latin became the language of the church. An important thing in the history of Old English is the arrival of Christianity and the arrival of Latin. Another major influence at that time was the attacks of the Vikings. The Vikings came from the north again, around the place from where the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came, but a little to the north. They are called the Scandinavian people. The Scandinavian people were also Germanic, but another set of tribes. And today the Scandinavian countries would be Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. And these people are also called the Danes, or the Danish people. So they also began attacking England, and they even occupied parts of England. So England came under the influence of the Scandinavian languages. And it is a long history of attack and occupation and a lot of disturbance in England. The Vikings were very destructive kind of people, so they destroyed many of the monuments of England, and many manuscripts that were written at that time, Old English manuscripts, were burned in Viking invasions. That's a long story. And we know that in history in 878 AD, King Alfred, who is called King Alfred the Great, is an Anglo-Saxon king. He defeated the Vikings at a battle called the Battle of Edington, and a separate region was established for the Vikings, which is called Danelaw. And there were even times when the Danes ruled England. So briefly, there was a period when the Danes ruled England, and King Canute ruled England for a while, and he died in the 11th century in 1035 here. King Canute was a Danish king. So it's interesting to know that during the Old English period, once the heptarchy, or the big empire, was established, consisting of the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Initially they were in small settlements, but over a century or so they grew into one nation. Not unified to a federation or anything, but they were mostly living in peace, or maybe occasional skirmishes were there. But there were strong kings who brought all these together and under them, and particularly during King Alfred, the different parts of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes regions were united under one king. So, and there were several kings, Anglo-Saxon kings, but for a while there were also Viking kings or Danish kings. King Canute is one of them, and he is remembered in history as King Canute the Great. After Canute and other Viking Danish kings, Anglo-Saxon kings came back, but they were not very strong. And the last Anglo-Saxon king, not exactly last, King Edward the Confessor, who was ruling England in the mid 11th century, died in 1066, and his relative King Harold became king under the name King Harold II, and he was defeated in the Battle of Hastings. Now look at this picture here. We have the history of different invasions to England. You had the Saxons coming in, you had the Angles coming in, you had the Jutes coming in. This is the first spell after the Romans left. And then you had the Vikings coming. You can see Norway here, Vikings coming from the Scandinavian area, and finally, towards the end of the Old English period in 1066, when Harold had crowned himself the King of England, and he ruled for a brief period of time, a few months, when the Normans, we mentioned the name Gaul. Gaul is this broad region, and Normans were a group of people. Today we would call them French people, and the Normans, led by a man named William. He is today remembered as William the Conqueror, who became the King of England under the title William, and today we call him William the First. And he came, he defeated and killed Harold, and he established a totally new regime in England. So that was the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule in England. The Anglo-Saxons continued to live in England, but the Old English period began to fade with the coming in of King William the Conqueror in 1066. So 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, when King Harold was killed, becomes a very important time where the Old English period is said to kind of end. So when we talk about the Old English period, we say it's begins about 5th century BC and goes on till around 1150, when by the time the impact of the Norman invasion became very dominant, and the language, Anglo-Saxon language, was pushed to the background, and French language gained ascendancy. But that is another story. We will come to that when we talk about the Middle English period. So here we must remember that in a period of about 5 centuries, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes settled in different parts of England, and they became a group of people. Today we remember them as Anglo-Saxons. We call them the Old English people, and they had their own culture, their own literature, their own kings. And here, this is the historic background of the Old English period, and which leads us to Old English literature, which spreads from around 600 to 1150 AD. And we will take it's a long period. If you think calmly, it will be the period from about Shakespeare's time to the present. It's a long period. But we don't have a lot of literature of the people of that time with us. We don't have a lot of literature of Old English period with us today, largely because the productivity was probably less compared to modern times, but much of the things that were written down in the form of manuscripts were destroyed both by the Vikings and later by King Henry VIII in the 16th century, which we will look at later on. So a lot of manuscripts are lost. Anyway, we will look at what evidence we have of Old English literature. Perhaps the oldest text in terms of literature would be Beowulf. As in other cultures, in English as well, the early literary works were mostly spread by the word of mouth. They were narrated by bards who would sit in public places and recite it to people. It must have been a few centuries after which people began to actually write down literature. And King Alfred did a big contribution to that. He promoted literature a lot, and many of the literature that was written at that time, that existed in the oral tradition or that were written in either Anglian dialects or the Kentish dialects, were all transliterated to West Saxon, and they are still preserved. So the earliest text would be Beowulf, and we believe that Beowulf was constructed or written in the continent. Even before the English people came to the British island, it was composed in an oral form while they were still in the continent, and it came to be written down only much later in England. And we have a manuscript which was written around maybe 7th century AD. Here there is a sample of Old English as it was written in the manuscripts, and this is the beginning lines of Beowulf. I'll try to read a few lines of it so that we'll have an idea of how Old English probably sounded. The opening lines of Beowulf: What we gardena in Yardagum, Theod Kuninga, Trim Efrunon, who the Athelingus Ellen Fremidon. It sounds like a totally different language, but still this is the oldest form of English. So today many people speak of Shakespeare's English as Old English, with the meaning that it's a bit old, but that would be an inexact term. Old English is this. This is Old English, the English that was spoken, that existed between approximately 600 AD to 1150 AD, which subsequently changed an immense lot. We will see how English changed during the Middle Ages when we come to Chaucer. Here, both in the way it was written and in the way it was pronounced, we know that English was very different in its earlier days. So we have Beowulf, the story of a hero named Beowulf who fought several monsters, giants, dragons like characters. And here you have the picture of him fighting Grendel, a monster. That is the earliest literary work of Old English period. Now, coming to other literary works, Old English poetry, we have a few documents that still exist in manuscript form, in which we have a few poetic works of that period left. For example, the Lover's Message, Widsith, Dio's Lament, Wanderer, Seafarer, etc. are examples of early works written, early poems written in the Old English period. They were very alliterative in their composition, and they covered different subjects like sad subjects about deaths and departures, about religious topics. Since England was Christianized, many religious poems were written. For example, Cadman's Hymn was a religious poem. Kinniwulf wrote religious poems, and there were many other religious poems, Christian poems at that time. And the Wanderer, Seafarer, as the name suggests, are about travel. The English people loved travel, loved the ocean, loved seafaring, and even today they are like that. That they are culturally, the sea, the ocean is in their blood. Yeah. We do not know many of the poets of that time because all the poems we mentioned, Lover's Message, Widsith, etc., they're all anonymous. They passed on. It must have been composed by somebody and other people adding to it, and they were written down only much later. We do not know who wrote them. But you have a couple of names we do have a few names, of which the important ones are noted down here. Cadman, whose hymn is very famous. Cadman lived in Whitby, in an abbey there. The legend is that Cadman was an ordinary, a lay person living in the abbey in Whitby, and he had a kind of divine inspiration, and he began to compose poetry. And only a few of his poems still remain, but he is more of a legendary character who lived in the 7th century. Another poet whose manuscript still remain and his signature still remains is Kinniwulf. He lived sometime in 9th century. We do not know the exact dates. Cadman we know because he is buried in a abbey, in a church called St. Margaret's Church, not far from the Whitby Abbey where he lived. Kinniwulf authored the Fates of the Apostles, Juliana, Ellen, and Christ. And we also know there are other works like Dream of the Rood, which was once ascribed to Kinniwulf, but we do not, modern researchers consider it to be of a different authorship. The Battle of Malden, these are all examples for Old English poetry. Old English prose, when we talk about Old English prose, we cannot forget King Alfred, because King Alfred did great service to the nation in two ways. It was he who controlled and established peace with the Vikings. We talked about that. He also promoted literature. He was he himself wrote much, and he also translated many works from Italian, Latin into English, into the West Saxon dialect of Old English. And he also got people to translate different works. So many of the Old English literature, even those written in other dialects like the Anglian dialects of Northumbrian or Mercian, they are all today, they are available today to us in the West Saxon dialect. It's totally because of King Alfred's great efforts. He commissioned the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a long history of England. He started it, and it went on being updated even up to the 12th century, which is 1154 up to it's a huge manuscript, a book which we still have access to, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in Anglo-Saxon language or English. And he personally translated many works, including Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care and the Ecclesiastical History of English People, written in the 8th century by Venerable Bede. We do not know a lot about him, but we know that it was a person named Venerable Bede who compiled a work called the Ecclesiastical History of English People in around the year 731 AD. It is from this book, this is a single source from which we have a lot of details about the early history of England, including the arrival of the Romans, etc. Though it's basically the religious history of England. So this is pretty much the literature. So you would have noticed that I have talked a lot about the historical part and not much about the literature part, because at this point of time, there are two reasons to this. We need to know the history of England, early history of England, because that laid the foundation of much of the English culture later on, and also English literature later on. And the literary output as such was less at that time, or the available material today on which we can work on is not much. So this is generally what we could talk about the English literature during the Old English period. So that is in short an introduction to the Old English period. In a coming video, we will be talking about the Middle English period, particularly the work done by Geoffrey Chaucer and his contemporaries. Thank you for listening.